title that can be interpreted in many different ways, and I think you might find many different interpretations coming as we sort of open up the discussion. What I plan to do is introduce the two of them very briefly, their work and the work they do both on and off the page. And then we will kick off a discussion which will look at a large number of social issues largely concerned with women's health, medical malpractices, that kind of area, which you will understand the reasons for it as soon as I tell you a bit about the books that you might or might not have heard of. And I plan to open it up to a question and answer session soon enough. I think we'll give it a more generous time for Q&A rather than the normal 10 minutes, because I think I've come to understand that the crowds in Jaipur are actually extremely engaged with social issues, and you will probably want to have something to say once you've heard the interesting topics that are going to be discussed. So to introduce my two wonderful panelists, I have Kishwar Desai, whose first book was Darling Ji, The True Love Story of Nargis and Sunil Dutt, a biography of the iconic Indian film actors which also covered 100 years of Indian cinema and history. However, it was her debut novel, Witness the Night, which was about female feticide and gendercide, that in 2010 captured the attention of the literary world by winning the prestigious Costa First Novel Award in the UK. It went on to win a slew of nominations. That's why I have this paper with me, actually, because I thought, I'm never going to remember all those many different names and nominations and prizes. But it was longlisted for the Man Asian Literary Prize, the DSC South Asian Literary Prize, and the Waverton Goodread Award. It was also shortlisted for the UK Authors Club Award. And Kishwar's second novel, Origins of Love, which I think she has a copy of, which she can probably show you, traverses the equally disturbing subject of commercial surrogacy. And that's the spin-off. The title has actually spun off from the subject of that book. And you will obviously hear a lot more about commercial surrogacy. I'm not sure how much people actually know about this. I learned a whole lot merely by reading Kishwar's book. But it's actually a growing and rather successful industry in India at the moment. And I think a lot of people first heard about it through the Amir Khan, Gauri Khan, what's his wife's name? The baby that was born quite recently via a surrogate mother. Rohini Nilekani, who started out her working life as a journalist, has written two books. Uncommon Ground, which was a spin-off from Rohini's 2008 show on NDTV that brought businessmen and social activists face to face. Stillborn, published in 1998, was a novel about medical malpractice and spurious drug trials, which, due to the continuing relevance of the subject, and actually growing relevance of the subject, is being re-released by Penguin Books this year. You have a copy of Stillborn, do you? Rohini is well known also for her philanthropic work, being founder-director of Arghyam, a charitable trust that funds initiatives in water and sanitation. She is also chairperson of Pratham Books, which, to use the words from the flyleaf of her own book, seeks to democratize the joy of reading for children and put a book in every child's hands. This should actually be a sort of slogan for festivals like this, I think. Rohini sits on the board of several non-profit organizations and funds work in education, health, microfinance, and the environment. I probably left out a lot on there as well, Rohini, but these are the ones that I was aware of. Now, to start with the books, both your books have been described using rather unusual terms, such as medical thriller. And I've heard you describing your book as a social thriller. And that rather intrigued me, because I know that both of you have journalistic backgrounds. And the kind of subjects that you've written about sort of demand journalistic sort of ways of dealing with it. But you've chosen the genre of thriller. I mean, was that difficult to do? How do you marry up the conventions and the requirements of a thriller with what's essentially journalistic information? Do you want to do that first, Kishwar?
Yeah, well, I think, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all of you for being here with us today. Basically, that was the point, you know, that I had been a journalist for many years. I was also a television anchor, producer. I used to make documentaries. I even ran a television channel, you know, so I did all sorts of things. And in each one of those careers, I did try and focus a lot on what was happening on women, I even fronted a Doordarshan show which is called Women at Work, in which we did a lot of issues which are related to gender. But you know what? I found that every time I did something non-fiction, people would look at it, look at the statistics and say, oh, that's terrible, how sad, and they would just switch to another channel or forget about it. So the reason I chose the format of a novel was I felt that this was something which people could connect with, even if you were not directly impacted by the issue. You could sort of understand the stories which lay behind some of the crimes and some of the social inequities. And if you could connect with it through your heart rather than through your mind, it would be stories then that you would remember, and you would try and think of ways to change and bring maybe a more egalitarian and equal society. I have to say these are all very noble intentions, and but I was sort of moved towards writing a novel. The reason I chose a crime novel was because the first issue I chose was a female feticide and infanticide. And I felt this is a very serious crime which often goes unreported, unregarded, where the whole family turns into a mob against a little baby girl and decides that it is going to end her life. So it's a crime which is actually sanctioned by society, and it is a crime that goes unpunished. So I wanted to write it in a way, in a racy way, so that people could read it, connect with it, and perhaps think about it. What exactly are they doing, and shouldn't they make a difference? And I also wanted to bring some sense of justice to this issue. You know, I felt this issue required something to be done about it. I couldn't just write it as a novel and leave it like open-ended and, you know, nothing will ever change, and therefore let's just all carry on, walk into the sunset. So I wanted to bring, so I think the crime novel sort of lent itself quite naturally to the issue that I was dealing with.
That particular subject. But I mean, did you find journalism also a sort of unsatisfying way of dealing with issues that novel writing kind of made easier for you?
Yeah, well, actually, at the time that I wrote Stillborn, and honestly, it seems like so many years ago, and I wish it wasn't as relevant, the subjects that I addressed, I wish they were no longer relevant, but it's very sad that I have to report, and I can give you data, that unfortunately things have become worse since I wrote this novel. At that time, I was a stay-at-home mom, and I couldn't do much journalism. But I feel there's a writer in all of us, and I bet there's a writer in every single person who's come to the Lit Fest here, and you know the story will come out someday, so keep writing. But I felt someday a book will come. And actually, I happened to read something in the papers about how in a surreptitious trial, people had given some women radioactive rotis to see what would happen. And I mean, without being a scientist, I can imagine what would happen. And somehow that stuck in my head a lot. And the plot developed from there. And when I started, because I was a journalist, I was used to doing research. So I started doing a lot of research, and the story of Keti and Purva emerged from there. But at the time I did this, Jayashree, there were very few people writing in this genre kind of style.
Yeah,
you know, this was so many years ago, and there weren't too many books in this kind of popular fiction trying to address something more serious in the garb of a novel of suspense. So although Stillborn was called a medical thriller, it was more gentle than those blood and gore thrillers that I was reading at the time. And like Kishwar, I had been a journalist, had done some television, and it felt like the story had to be told in this form. So that's really what happened.
I must admit, I read both books. I mean, I'm not entirely naive. I'm aware of what's happening in India. But I read both books with a certain aghast, rather breathless sense of, surely this can't be true. I mean, there's spurious drug trials on tribal women and malformed babies being born. You know, you've got the whole business of women being kept like battery chickens, you know, while they're pregnant, carrying other people's children. I was interested in the research. I mean, how much of this was based on fact? Were you treating it like the journalists that you once were, in going out and getting actual facts on which you could base this? And I kept saying, I hope it's just their imagination.
Unfortunately not, Jayashree, because what Jayashree is referring to is my second book, which is called Origins of Love. So because I'd written a crime novel, or as you said, a social thriller, which was my first book, and it was quite accidental. I wasn't supposed to write a second book. I hadn't thought about it, a second fictional book. But my central character was liked by my publishers and by people, by readers. A Punjabi woman who's very feisty, and she wants to make a difference. She's a social worker come detective. And so we were really examining issues, and there is no end of issues that she could have looked at. But surrogacy, which is, as you know, the rent-a-womb business, which is doing extremely well in India these days. It's become a billion-dollar business in this country. Sort of naturally jumped out at me because there was, unfortunately, as you said, there were so many aspects to this, which are absolutely something made out of science fiction, or what I imagined was science fiction, you know, which is like sperms, you know, the sperm is flown in from one country in little, you know, boxes, okay, you know, iced liquid nitrogen. It comes in, and then, you know, donor eggs are supplied by somebody else, and there is a laboratory where these babies are created, and it's all happening in this country. So medical science is helping people to have babies, but it is helping babies to have, helping people to have babies in very different ways to the way we had understood it. And now, because they are using extremely poor women in this country to have to produce children for wealthier people who could be foreigners, who could be NRIs, who could be Indians, who unfortunately for whatever reason are not able to have their own children. So these were issues which lent itself to a closer examination, and I have to say that some of the things I found out, I mean, I couldn't have made it up. I mean, even the things I tried to make up, I thought this couldn't possibly happen, and so let me just put this down as part of the novel. And to my horror, Jayashree, even that was correct. So there is so much which is being done to women's bodies. There is so much, as you mentioned, that, you know, experimentation that is going on with women's wombs, with people in general, especially if you do not have the right to defend, or you do not have the means to defend yourself and look after yourself. Then the health sector and the medical sector is growing so fast. So there's a lot going on there. And so when I wrote Origins of Love, I had no dearth of information. It was becoming difficult. What do I include and what do I leave out?
Yeah. And the level, the extent of the foreign market, the fact that people are coming from abroad to use Indian women for the IVF treatment and so on. Is that also sort of established? I mean, it's something that's growing.
Yeah, it's I'm sure it's happening in Rajasthan. It's certainly happening in Delhi. It's happening in Mumbai, in Gujarat. Fertility clinics are just popping up, if that's the right word to use, all over the place, because it is a problem. You know, fertility is declining all over the world. Fertility levels are going down. So people are looking at different and new ways to have children, and if they can't have children, even gay couples and so on, they also face the same problem. So I do want to make clear, I have nothing against anybody wanting to have a child. I'm a mother myself. I understand very well the need and the desire to have a child, but there is an ethical issue when you start using people's bodies and you start doing something in laboratories, and it is all being done in a very hush-hush fashion. There is no law regulating it. You know, the Assisted Reproductive Technology Act has not even been presented in Parliament. So, you know, these things are going on without any regulatory body looking into it. So there is a lot of exploitation. So I think we need to examine this. And as Rohini said, you know, when you start looking into it, you just hope that things will get better. But it's been years. It's been 10 years or 20 years since this business started, but nothing has happened.
No, it's the same thing. I did a lot of research for Stillborn then, and the situation is worse today. The Drug Controller of India doesn't simply have the resources. India has become one of the world's most popular destinations for clinical trials. And now clinical trials are supposed to be done with informed consent. You should be able to know what exactly is the risk you are facing when you try out a medicine for some drug manufacturer. But often, as you know, in India, it's not always transparent and upfront.
Well,
just, you know, there have been hundreds of deaths in clinical trials in India, and very few of them have got compensation from the government. I mean, think about this. Imagine if any one of us were using some anti-cancer medicine and we didn't really know what it was, and we died, and the government, nobody even gave us the basic justice. First of all, to prevent us from being abused by these are powerful agents between us and the pharmaceutical sector. And that's what's happening with impunity in this country even today. It's quite shocking, frankly.
And this is being carried out amongst tribal
And I was just reading, and then, yes, some of the most recent anti-cancer vaccines were tried out on tribal girls. And there are many middlemen you see in between this whole process. And again, regulation, access to justice, I mean, access to the courts, very basic things like that are still, we have a long way to go on after 62 years of being declared a republic. Abhi republic banana hai. Banana republic nahi hai. Republic banana hai.
We're sounding, you know, it's a bit curious that we're sounding a lot more horrified by the whole issue, by both these issues actually, and they're linked in very closely to each other. But when I was reading the books, I got a sort of strong sense of your refusing to moralize. I actually did think that you were not taking sides. Was it some sort of conscious thing you were trying to do, a bit like a good journalist would do, sort of trying to let people decide for themselves? There are two sides to the story, and I'm thinking more about surrogacy here than about the drug trials. Is that you can take a view that maybe it's not such a bad thing for someone to want to perform a benevolent act. A woman who has children quite easily on her own might actually want to help a couple who are childless and desperate and want...
You know, you're so right, because, you know, the first stories that came out about surrogacy in this country were all these feel-good and happy stories. You know, there is a clinic in Gujarat, you know, where lots of babies are being born to couples who come from abroad, and they can't have children, and so these women are helping them to have children. But if you go deeper into the background of these stories, then you discover that these are actually extremely poor women who are sometimes being forced. You know, in the past, they would have, perhaps they were so poor they could have been sex workers, but that is not respectable. That is not a profession that they could get into. So instead of selling their vaginas, if I may use that word quite bluntly here, they are selling their wombs. So they are being used literally like cash cows to produce children for somebody else. So sometimes they do it out of choice because they are poor. Sometimes they're being pushed into it by agents who offer them all sorts of, you know, glorious, wonderful. But I have personally heard stories about women who have had children for couples, and they have been paid as little as 30,000 rupees for that, for the entire 9 months that they have gone through living away from their families. And one couple I sort of was told about actually decided to take her along with them as an ayah, you know, as a maid, to look after the 2 children that she had produced. Another one used to express milk. You know, she would sort of, the milk would then be frozen and sent in bottles to sort of be fed to the children who went away to another country. So, you know, it's all very easy to say this is very altruistic, and of course she's paid something and she's being looked after, but it doesn't work, because for a woman, and all of you must have, you know, those who are mothers, those who know people who have children, who have emotional attachments, how difficult it is to give up a child. But the indoctrination that these women are given is so clever that they're told, no, it's like a guest. तुम्हारे घर में मेहमान आया है ना, वैसे मेहमान को कुछ दिन रखो और फिर उसका विदा कर दो. You know, so that is the way they're indoctrinated.
But do they
There's no psychological counseling done. Nothing is done to help them get over whatever trauma.
But do they feel like keeping the baby sometimes?
Yes.
So something coming out of your body is not mine. How do you tell yourself
How do you
that?
tell yourself?
It's things like this that the new assisted reproductive technology bill is trying to look at. It's still in draft, as Kishore said.
Yeah.
And amongst the things is the legality of, you know, if there is a change of heart somewhere along the way.
Well, you know, it did happen in the UK. There was this woman who just decided that the commissioning parents, now, you see, this world is divided into the gestational mother, That's the mother who carries the baby. Then there are the commissioning parents, the parents who commission the child. So the gestational mother, in this case in the UK, decided she didn't want to give the baby up because she said these are not good enough parents. And the judge actually ruled in her favor. But in India, what happens is that there are contracts which are drawn up, which state in certain cases that the woman will even give up her right to life. She will agree to be kept on a life support system in order to save the child, because if there is something which is impacting the child and it needs to be saved, then the mother's life will be sacrificed, the gestational mother's life will be sacrificed in order to save the child. So when these are issues that we all need to be aware of.
But if I can just again try and view it from the other angle, and if I can put this question to you, Rohini, is if you think about it, men have been allowed to sell their reproductive capacity from whenever. Sperm banks have been around for a long, long time. But when it comes to women, and the same sort of thing, and I realize it's different because of the whole 9-month gestational period. But when it comes to the idea of women selling this, their reproductive capacity, suddenly there's a whole sort of loaded kind of, it's loaded with ideas of morality and chastity and this kind of special mother-child relationship, which somehow has actually been rather convenient for men, because it kind of absolves them of their sort of duties towards the child rearing and so on. So what do you think to that, Rohini?
I mean, it's really a difficult terrain to go into, but you're right that it's different when it's women's bodies,
Quite right.
There have been a lot of discussions at the festival about women's bodies and men's understanding about how women's bodies are to be used or commodified. But if you think about it, throughout our culture, we had wet nurses, so isn't that the allowing of a woman's own production of milk to be used for somebody else's baby? So it's not that it's been uncommon in some form or the other. But I think when it's so commodified, I mean, in some sense, the dye or the wet nurse would be embedded in some way. And I'm not saying it was not an exploitative situation. It could well have been. But from what I understand, it is at least not, it was embedded in some sense. This is complete strangers from around the world who are just actually renting your womb. Is there a difference between that and what used to be before? It's very tricky.
And I think it's a more clear-cut argument when we're talking about the drug trials and that kind of medical
malpractice. That's very different from this.
There's more clarity to that situation.
It's much more clear-cut, absolutely.
But did you not worry? I mean, you talk about the role played by multinationals, by these big research institutes and hospitals. I couldn't help wondering, as I was reading the book, did you not worry at any stage that somebody would slap a lawsuit on you, or that there would be... I mean, I don't ask this question lightly, because what I was worrying about was the fact that as a journalist, you enjoy this kind of public interest defense, which as a novelist, you don't. You can't say, I did this in the sort of general public interest. People ought to know that this is happening.
Really, so I would have thought fiction writers have much more of that kind of defense, and as a journalist, I really have to check every single fact. Actually, all my facts were very much checked in the novel as well, but I thought fiction writers would have more license. And I think much of what I said in the novel happened really to have been backed by facts. So I was not leaping to too many conclusions. But no, I wasn't at all very worried about a lawsuit, but I did want to show that the Indian pharma industry was growing very rapidly, and post-GATT and when TRIPS, it was going to have to face worldwide competition. Was it going to sink or was it going to swim? And if it was going to swim, was it going to abide by international norms, or was it going to do shady things, for making a fast buck and trampling over human rights? And that was the story I tried to tell, that this is what can happen, and unfortunately it's happening. So,
and it's still, how many, more than 10 years down the line?
10 years, but I think it's not going to be too long before good regulation will come in. Some regulation has come, and much more is on the anvil, because there's an international eye on these things now. So I think it's not going to be too long before you'll get much more robust regulation.
There's, in fact, the ART Act also, there's a great many number of organizations that are watching it very closely and lobbying very hard on behalf of the rights of... there's an organization called Sama, Women's Health, and they've actually written a piece in the Motherhood Anthology which talks about the things that need to change to make it a bit more of a level playing field. But if I can just, before we move on to other things, explore the responsibility of a fiction writer. I mean, if you have it in you, you have the gift of fiction in you, is it sort of incumbent on you in some way to use that art to change things, to proselytize, to open the, windows in people's minds? Or is that too kind of pompous an agenda? So storytellers just be storytellers.
Yeah, it makes me very uncomfortable to say that, okay, I've written an issue-based novel, because nobody wants to read an issue-based novel. And I don't want to be sort of loaded with that weight on my shoulders that I'm trying to change society. But I do want to make it very clear that what you see in front of you is one very angry woman. I am really furious. When I start writing on any of these subjects, I get so angry, I possibly forget about everything else, because when you think of the extent of exploitation, and we've seen it happen recently in Delhi with the Nirbhaya case and so on, is that what is happening to women in this country makes me extremely alarmed, extremely angry. So when I wrote my first novel, it was not to change society, but it was just to put on record that, hey guys, please wake up. This is our country, this is our women, this is what we're doing to them, and please do something about it. So similarly, when I wrote the surrogacy novel, it was just to make people aware, perhaps, but not to bring about social change, because who am I to bring about social change? I'm only a writer. But what I can possibly do is perhaps engage some of you in a dialogue, engage some of you with you mentally, through contact, through email, through reading my book. Somebody may be motivated to do something about it. So that's about all I can do. But is it necessary for a writer to do this? No. But as I said, I grew up in this country, I've worked here, these issues are very dear to my heart. So whereas the next novel I'm going to write is probably going to be a very romantic novel with absolutely no issues apart from that. But somehow, I think maybe it's my background also as a journalist and so on, I cannot separate the real life from the life that I'm inventing in my books.
I sort of worried a little bit that, we run the risk of making light of what are actually very serious issues. I'm not saying we do, but there is that risk. And I wondered whether it might be best to sort of say, in some ways what you are doing is, you do a lot of social work, a lot of work in social enterprise outside of the writing.
Yeah.
So,
I wouldn't put the burden of my wouldn't put that on my fiction writing at all. I write a lot of stuff for myself, which is not non-fiction, but which is just poetry or something. Yeah. But I wouldn't put my social conscience burden onto that. I think art comes from some other place, or the creativity comes from other places. It's a mirror, it's a dark, stormy place, it's sunlight, there's lots of things. I wouldn't put that burden on that. I would hold myself accountable as a philanthropist or as a social activist for what I do, or even as a journalist, I would think. But I would leave the realm of art, I would not hold it to that it's not supposed to change society for the moral good or something like that. That's what I feel. So
we're looking for solutions.
Yeah, not in art. Not in art.
You wouldn't do it by
if this qualifies as art, I don't know. But it's writing, it's fiction, it's something that came from a sense of creativity, or wanting to express oneself. But I wouldn't burden it, is all I'm saying.
Change things, and you maybe need to get your hands dirty and go out there and do a lot of actual sort of social work.
Yeah, I feel the need, yeah.
As you do.
But one thing I wanted to say after what you said is, in India, you wonder, do we have respect for life? Or is it that at a certain point, you can't afford to have respect for life? Some of the work we were doing with in hospitals, saving the lives of little children, whether they needed to be on respirators or stuff, we managed to save a lot of lives. But very often, there were these heart-rending moments when a child was on a life support system and we were paying for it. But the parents would come and say, this is it, today is the last day, we have to take the child and go away. Because they had such terrible choices to have to make, because there were other children at home, or they were waiting in the hospital and couldn't earn their daily wages. And it was more expensive for them to keep this child alive, even though we were paying the medical expenses. So, the kind of heart-rending stuff and the choices that the poor have to make, you can't, life doesn't seem to have a value in those circumstances. And this is a society that we all have to we are living in, but we mustn't accept.
Given the range of social work that you're doing, what, in your opinion, I mean, this is not a novelist looking for a subject for a big social novel myself, but what, in your opinion, are the biggest problems that are facing us? Is it in the area of women's health? Is it in the area of gendercide, the feticide, the female infanticide that you were talking about, which are then skewing our gender ratios so badly in so many of our states that, all the issues that we've been talking about so much, the gang rapes and so on. And I know your next book is actually about rape and gang rape in particular, isn't it?
Yeah. Sadly, I mean, it's a novel I'd written about 6 months ago. I had no idea that, rape talked about the security of women, not just, when they're little and when they've just been born, which is about female feticide, infanticide, but later on when they've grown up and the whole issue of rape, which has become such a big thing today. So I think security of life is a very big problem, and that sort of impacts everything. But I do agree with Rohini that, you cannot just allow the writing to be sort of totally subjugated by the issue. So I do try very hard at the same time as a novelist to try and tell a good story. I do have romance, for example, in all my novels. I do try and have a sense of relationships, the characters. I do have a sense of plot. Sorry?
No, sorry, I was going to say there are two. You said I have romance and a love interest. I was going to say there are two extremely dishy men in both your books.
Yes, we have good-looking guys.
Romance novels as a teenager, I think. I'm sorry, but that's what happened.
So you do write books, but then you also, as I said, the new novel, for example, which is about rape. These are very difficult issues to write about, because I think I was following, for example, a real-life case, and that is what the novel talks about. Of course, it's fictionalized when you will read it. Hopefully some of you will read it. And I do feel it's very important then to get to a point where you begin to examine that there is no black and white, but there should be at least, at the very, very least, we should expect that there will be a good system of law, there will be a good system of justice, that if something happens to you, you will be given some sort of due hearing, because that is not what happens in this country. The case that I was following, for example, of rape, the girl was killed, she was raped and then murdered, but the two boys who did it are actually, even now, they're out on bail. They have settled down happily. They have families. The whole case, which is a very high-profile case in its time, has been completely forgotten. So, as we sit here today, we must all remember that. And we must remember that Nirbhaya's case was not the first one. There are lots and lots of cases before this where no justice has been delivered. And I think we must all fight for at least the very basic to get a sense that we will get redressal if something happens to any one of us.
I think that might be a good moment actually to open it up to the audience. We have about 15
we
or
should
20
talk
minutes.
a little about solutions. You want to talk just a bit about...
If we can, I want to come back to Rohini for 1 minute. So hang on to your questions for another 5 minutes. Because there was, when we were talking earlier about discussing problems and, opening up the fact that the books that they write open people's eyes to various problems. Rohini was very clear, and I can see where this comes from. It's because of the social work that she does. But she said, let's also talk about solutions. I mean, it's so important that we don't just, it's very easy to sit here and bang on about all the different problems that India has. But there are people who are coming up with solutions as well, and I think I'd be quite happy for Rohini to take this
So
forward.
just take a couple of minutes that, sometimes in a time like this when we've been reading the papers and we've all felt so frustrated and angry about so much that is happening in this country, and the rape case helped us to come to a moment to go outside ourselves and say, this is wrong. Even if we are men, we are out on the streets, we don't think this is the right way to treat women. And I thought that was a kind of a very interesting point, that we are going beyond us. Now the middle classes, people like us, we have to go beyond just our class and say what's happening outside, and that's 100% going to impact on us. It's not right where it's happening, but it's not right for us either. And I can see an opening out now of that empathy, which I think is going to be an important point in our nation's history. But also, there's a lot happening in women's empowerment, and some of these things are actually a backlash to women actually getting more power for themselves. If you look around the country, no other country in the world has elected 1 million of its women to local political power. 1 million women have held political office. And surely and slowly but surely that's going to have an impact. Women have a voice when they sit in the Gram Sabhas, when they sit in the Gram Panchayats. They are showing what are their priorities in the local planning. So they might have priority for a health clinic, or a school, or even a water system over, say, a road or something else, access to market even.
So are you saying that this
so that's happening.
Trickle down
There
kind
is.
of effect?
There are 45 to 60 million women, based on which data sets you look at, who have been part of their own institutions, of self-help groups. 45 to 60 million women. And these are institutions of empowerment where women can sit together and do collective action, because it's very hard for one woman to fight all by herself. But 10 women together, slowly but surely, the voice is getting heard, new questions are being asked, and some are being answered. So I just wanted to say that process is something we should all find ways to support. And all of us can support it in some way or another, because it's also happening in urban areas. I mean, the same questions are being opened up in urban areas, just beyond our zones of comfort. So I think it's all positive that this boil is coming, you know. It's a good thing.
We shouldn't lose heart, is what you're saying.
Yes.
If it's not so apparent just yet that the things are gradually improving and changing.
But they are.
They are. I'll take your word for it, and I hope I see real evidence of that soon. So questions, anyone? I can't see. We have to wait for the mic to come to you. So basically, whoever has the mic gets to speak. If I can just ask you, whether it's a question or a statement, I'm not one of those moderators who'll say no statements at all, but please do keep it brief, because there's a lot of people who want to speak, and you want to hear the responses as well from the panelists. So brief, please.
Sure. It's actually a question for Rohini. I mean, you mentioned that there's a lot of women who are now in local politics, and therefore the change will come.
Oh.
Yeah. So if you look at the record of the Indian politicians, the female politicians who've been in power, if you look at what the National Commission for Women typically does, you know, you don't really see much evidence of them coming out in support of women's issues. I mean, they go out and say, oh, being called sexy is a compliment. You know, even if you look at women in corporate places, it's not that they've made corporate policies which empower more women to come into the workforce. So what gives you the hope that this is going to change in future?
No, how can you say that? There are more women in the workforce. So yes, women's participation in the labor force is still low in India. And in fact, there's a lot of hidden labor that's not being counted perhaps. But you're seeing much more of an increase of women coming into jobs that absolutely were not, they were not able to access even 10 or 20 years ago. So that's going to cause a churn. But there is a response in happening. And in fact, I would say in many of the bigger companies, they've made many more and more progressive policies because they've had to, because there's public pressure on them. And we will see that happening in more places. And we will have to ask for it. It's not that we can absolve ourselves from holding ourselves accountable to demand that. So I see that as we raise our voice, that we will get the response. There's no way the response will not come. But it's not, I'm not saying it's easy. These are political issues, and we have to engage in a political struggle for them. But I don't think it's only doomsday. I think things are improving.
Baby selling is something which is frowned upon in most societies. In fact, it is illegal. So I want you to respond to something that how is surrogacy different from baby selling? Because in some cases, the mother might actually not be able to take care of the baby. So how is it different?
No, I just want to explain that surrogacy is is very different from selling your own child, because surrogacy in the true sense happens right now, the way it is being conducted in this country, is that there is a commissioning couple, which means that there is a father and a mother out there who usually give their sperm and their egg. The child is created in a laboratory, or rather the embryo is created in a laboratory, and then it is implanted in the womb of a woman who will then carry it to full term. So really, there may not be a bloodline. There can be a bloodline also. In some cases, the woman donates the egg for the creation of the child. But legally, there is a contract that is signed right in the beginning which says that she will not have any claim to this child because this child has been commissioned by another set of parents. So it's not like she's selling her own baby. There is a difference.
She's just renting the womb.
She's she's renting the womb out as a space to create somebody else's child. Yeah. Otherwise, you can get all the details in the book. Yeah.
Sorry, may I, please?
Yeah.
I think that on an issue which is burning to all women, I'm not sure whether a man like me should use better part of the valor and not to pose the question at all. Right? It's a great risk that I'm running. But I happen to be a doctor coming from Mumbai, and I was doing clinical drug research. And I have used some patients as guinea pigs, as you might want to say, all to the salutary reasons. I have been volunteered myself to take new drugs before I could give it to my patients. And this is inevitable. I think there are two issues which I may submit very humbly and quite quickly. As science progresses, Aldous Huxley predicted 1920 the brave new world of medicine, and we are having it right now. And there's a yawning gap between society and the progress of science. And the second is the economic compulsions. In the 70s, boys at railway stations in Mumbai got themselves vasectomized for 25 rupees. Blood donations have been made for 100 rupees. So this sort of a thing which you are complaining about, it is in a way inevitable. So it's only necessary that enlightened women take the issues to the forefront and make sure that science is not thwarted. Clinical drug research will have to be carried on. Would you, with any of them, the audience would take a new drug all by themselves?
Sir, I'm sorry, but injustice is not inevitable. Injustice is not inevitable.
That is exactly the thrust that I'm appealing. There is no case for injustice. Mind you, I'm not pleading that this should be carried ad lib of anything of the sort, but regulatory necessary.
I think the regulations are missing,
but to ban clinical drug research altogether,
we're not saying that.
Progress.
We're not saying that
We're not asking to ban clinical research. We're saying that informed consent, which is a prerequisite,
and proper regulations is what we're asking for. Yeah.
That's what we are saying. We're not saying that don't do clinical research trials. All of us are beneficiaries of that.
And neither am I saying don't do surrogacy at all. We're just saying have proper regulations, make sure people are not exploited. Yeah?
A quick question. As a lawyer by training, I find it, I'm a bit skeptical when you put too much faith on so-called good regulation to curb social problems, because regulations are interpreted, made, and whatever. Justice delivered by the same people who today knows about these things and don't talk about them. So I think, I don't know, social action to create, an issue has to be understood by people. Regulations has been there for dowry, for a lot of those social issues, and nothing has happened. So I don't know how much, perhaps in the next book, can criticize a bit of the laws, and then they can start.
I feel a bit worried when I see a young man who's going to be a lawyer saying something like this. You are a lawyer. So that makes me even more worried, because I would expect that somebody like you would take on these issues head on, make sure that the law is followed, or make sure there is a law. Firstly, in this case, there isn't even a law. But if there is a law, make sure that it is applied properly, it is followed. And why not? Why cannot we become a law-abiding society? What's wrong with us? I mean, what's different about us? All over the world, there are laws. People do follow them. They do break them as well, but not to the extent that we do, and not to the extent that we exploit the marginalized in this country. And we have to stop doing that, you know. I mean, we shouldn't be so skeptical and say it can't ever be done. It can. It's up to us. We are the society we create. It's all up to us.
And maybe lend your services
regulation
to one
is
of
not
these
a silver bullet. Often regulation does lag behind innovation, as we know, because information speeds ahead of the regulators in many cases, and it takes time to catch up. So I agree with you. Regulation is only one of the many things that need to be done. Social action, collective action, information, knowledge, awareness, empowerment, all those are things that have to come first, but we do need strong regulation as well. Not by itself, it won't solve any problem.
And we need good lawyers like you.
Hi, in the back. This question is for Kishore Desai. You mentioned the Delhi gang rape case and how there have been thousands of other girls who've gone through something similar, or even the same thing. So why do you think the Indian media or the country in general has taken so long to wake up to such a thing? Like, there have been thousands of cases before this one, but why has this one taken such national importance? Or why do you think it hasn't been addressed so visibly in the media or in the country before this case?
Well, I think to answer the first question, the second question first, is why did this get national importance? One, I have to say that thank God the media has woken up at last to the injustice that has been done to women all this while. One of the reasons it was so high profile was, yes, sadly, because it happened in Delhi, because it happened at a time of 24/7 media on a public transport bus, and the details of the case were so gruesome that you just couldn't turn away from them. You couldn't just say, pretend, oh no, it never happened. Of course this has happened. It's happened in villages, in cities, in towns, all over the country. The reason I think, again, sadly, that it has been because of us. We have not, I would say this both of men and women, we have just not addressed the issue of gender. This country definitely needs a second women's liberation movement. It needs us all to come together, not just women, but men, women, everybody together to make sure that women get proper rights and proper protection and proper security. And I don't mean separate buses for women, which I think is the most ridiculous idea ever. Make women stay at home at 10 o'clock, which is stupid. Make them wear different kinds of clothes. No. We are part of society. We have to be integrated properly into society. And it's up to us to ensure that we do it. So as families, as all of us, if we continue to neglect it, then it'll be a problem. But you know, you are young, you can make this change happen, and we really, really, all of us need to work on it together.
Actually, when Rohini and I were talking about this backstage earlier, you said something about it being very important to take men along with us in this whole movement, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we do need to take men along with us, and boys as well, because you know, men in our society have been often given the message that they have to be a certain way. And all of us fear losing power. And maybe men, cannot go inside a man's head, but maybe men do fear losing some kind of supremacy. And maybe men have their own issues. So I think more spaces created in our country in our way for men to be able to express their hopes and their fears more boldly without being trapped into images. Those were the things that were discussed last century in many Western societies. And today the societies are a little more androgynous, where men are allowed to feel both their female side a little bit with more justification and more of a liberal attitude. I think we have a long way to go for that, but we have to open those conversations. What do men fear? We need to know. What is it that they fear?
And again, you're fairly optimistic that we will.
We have to have those conversations, yes, and we have to start with the boys and the girls, yeah.
Yeah, I have one question. In fact, it's here. Jayashree, this side. Jayashree, look straight. You straight.
Okay, someone who knows me.
Okay, yeah, it's all right. As long as you hear the voice, because you asked a very pertinent question. Just now, ma'am asked a pertinent question saying, what men fear. Sounded like Chaucer saying, what women want. But anyway, coming back to the point, I just wanted to understand, since it's a forum of literature, is there any form of chauvinism in literary representation of empathy towards women? Because the panel is full of women. It would have been so nice to see a man in that panel also.
You've had men on our panel.
There are men in the audience, and you just spoke well.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Just if you could address this question. Thank you.
Why don't you answer that?
Oh, sorry. I sort of got myself lost a little bit.
You want to repeat?
Can I just say something on this, on literary? Should I answer a bit and then maybe pass it on?
Yes, ma'am. I'm just repeating the question. The crux of the question is that is there any form of chauvinism in the literary representation of empathy towards women?
You mean in these particular books?
No.
Not in these particular books.
Overall,
in general.
So can I just give a quick answer for myself and then maybe Rohini?
Sure, ma'am.
Yes, and yes. I couldn't repeat that more, because I think one of the things which enrages me is the depiction of women. As I said, a lot of things make me angry, but this is in literature, in cinema, definitely we've had a lot of discussion on this very platform, so I won't get into that, the way women are depicted in that. Even sometimes in art, we need to keep on re-examining these images and what they do to us. So definitely the reason I chose to make my character the way she is, I won't give away everything, but the way she is in her book, is because she was a response to what I was reading. I feel we need to change these images. Yeah.
I just had someone flashing a sign at me saying time up.
Okay.
So I think, sorry, you might have to come to a very abrupt end with this, and I can still see hands going up, Shirish. No more time?
Don't have gaps between
Right, there's another session that's about to start.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you all for being such an engaged audience, and thanks, of course, to my two wonderful panelists, Kishwar Desai and Rohini Nilekani.
Thank you so much, Kishwar. Thank you, Rohini. Thank you, Jayashree, very much. I'm sorry we had to cut you off, but please continue the discussion with them. They will be signing books at the book signing area at the back of the lawns. So please follow them there to continue your discussions and to get your books signed. I'd like to thank Rajasthan Patrika again. This has been the second lecture in the series we've hosted here, the last one being Sex and Sensibility, which was also excellent. So thanks to all of you. Our next session, Sunset on Empire, begins in 5 minutes, so please do, take your seats for that one.